Welcome to Beyond the Valley, a CNBC tech podcast with Arjun Karpal and Tom Chitty.
Beyond the Valley.
It's not an exaggeration to say that the artificial intelligence revolution has been dominated by American companies. The likes of OpenAI and Nvidia have been fueled by billions of dollars of investment that was deemed necessary to continue to lead the AI race. But that theory is now being questioned following the release of the latest large language model from Chinese company DeepSeek, which was reportedly built for a fraction of the cost. In this week's episode, we'll discuss how DeepSeek blindsided many investors, if it's a serious threat to the American firm's dominance, and whether this is the start of a new chapter in the AI story.
Beyond the Valley.
Well, it's nice to be back. You've been busy. I've been busy.
Where have you been, Tom? Where have you been? Our listeners want to know. You've got some big news.
Yes. My wife had a child. There's numerous children in the household, so I've been busy trying to raise the children. Help raise the children.
Congratulations to you all, Tom.
Thank you.
It's nice to have you back.
Yeah, it's nice to be back.
And you've come back at a very busy, not chosen an easy time to return to work.
No. Well, I did manage to miss Davos, but which was really.
Yeah.
How was that?
Yeah, it was great. And our listeners probably have heard the first episode we've published out of that with the Binance CEO. There's a few more to come. There were some really big names we interviewed there. It was great.
Yeah,
really good conversations.
Yeah, I listened to the Binance of it. It was fantastic, and I recommend all our listeners to listen to that. And there will be more of those coming. So well done. Before we get into the meat of this story, yesterday you were in the Netherlands at the headquarters of ASML, talking to the CEO of the company, and it's one of the most important companies in the world. I don't think that's an overstatement, and maybe a company that many of our listeners haven't heard of before, and they're probably thinking, why are we talking about this Dutch company? But it is important in this wider story to explain that it has implications as to the seriousness of what's been going on this past week, but also that there is a future in AI, a big future, and the CEO had lots to say about that. Could you tell us a little bit?
Yeah, so after this DeepSeek story came out, and we're going to dig into the specifics about DeepSeek if our listeners haven't sort of caught up on it, but visited ASML. Remember, this is a company that make these sort of very advanced machines and tools that are required to manufacture the most advanced chips in the world. And so when you think about AI, ASML is a key part of that story because in the supply chain for the chips, and those chips are then required to train up these big models in artificial intelligence. And so being there at the company was fascinating. It's a little town called Veldhoven, just outside of Eindhoven, and it's really incredible to think that this very small place is like one of the epicenters of European tech, but also one of the sort of focal points between the US and China's big technology battle. Now, speaking to the CEO, Christophe Fouquet, he was a very interesting character. And he was talking about how he thinks that the developments in DeepSeek, where there is more efficiency in AI models and potentially they're cheaper to run and train, is a good thing, because it means that if the cost of the technology gets cheaper, it may become more ubiquitous and widespread and therefore used more widely than it is today. And actually, that means we'll need more chips to run that, more compute power. And so he saw it actually as a positive, and something we're going to dig into as we go through this conversation about how the tech industry is viewing it, i.e. as a threat, or whether they actually think there's opportunities here as well. One other thing, the CEO is very tall. During the interview, I was standing on
a box.
A couple of layers of paper, paper packs. Those packs of paper you buy for the
like
printer.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, so a couple of those because we didn't have sort of a box handy to stand on. So that was great.
But you're not that short.
I'm not mega sure, but he's very tall. And it was great. It's a great little behind the scenes look sometimes when we do this stuff. We're on air and, we need to get a shot. So I need to stand on a box or, need to sort of look taller than I am. A little behind the scenes information there.
The glamour
of it all. Yeah, standing on printing paper.
Good stuff. All right, let's we've obviously touched on, kind of what's been going on in DeepSeek, but let's go back a little bit and explain kind of who DeepSeek are, what do they do, and why they've caused such a stir.
So just to go back to the founding of DeepSeek, which happened in 2023 by a person called Liang Wenfeng. But prior to that, he actually ran a hedge fund, which he founded in 2015. The hedge fund developed these models for basically computerized stock trading and also used machine learning, which is a sort of form of AI. So in the process, they'd amassed this huge infrastructure effectively to do what they were doing in the hedge fund, including some Nvidia chips used to train AI models. Just a refresher, Nvidia very much the gold standard right now for the graphics processing units and broader chip architecture required to train these big AI models. Now, DeepSeek, when it was founded, sought to develop a foundational model. And the latest generation of that model is known as V3. And we're going to get a bit into the specifics of that model soon as well. It's also created a so-called reasoning model known as R1. And I think our listeners will hear this term reasoning bandied about a bit more. And it's this idea that actually the model starts to think like a human. So as we reason to get a response, that's the idea of the model, where you may put an input into it and ask it a question, and it goes through various paths before landing on an answer.
And it then will sort of divulge the thought process behind them coming to that answer. Is that
it can do? Okay. I think in the background it can, but ultimately, as a user, you'll see the answer it kind of arrives at, and perhaps along the way it may talk about the way it's got there, but it's about trying to mimic almost the way humans think, and so this is the next level, right, really, of some of these models, which the likes of OpenAI and others are also focusing on as well. So basically, you got V3 foundational model, R1 the reasoning model, and it's another competitor to all of these models that are out there, including, as I mentioned, OpenAI. And so why has it caused a stir? Well, the company released this scientific paper that claimed its model, the V3, cost under $6 million to train. And they said it was trained on Nvidia H800 chips, which are a less advanced chip than that's currently available. And Nvidia designed these chips because their more advanced chips were actually banned from being exported to China, so they created a China-compliant version of it. However, this model, and especially R1, has surpassed the performance in some areas of other models. And the fact that DeepSeek claimed it was trained on such little money versus, the billions of dollars other companies have spent has shocked the tech world.
And that moment that people were realizing, because that model had been out since, I think, the 20th of January, but it was only when it started rising up the App Store charts when, investors actually took note that this was a really popular chatbot that was being downloaded. And
just to that point, I mean, everyone was kind of saying, it came out of nowhere. It didn't. I was talking about DeepSeek in December last year. Yeah. And the company has done very well to actually publish papers about what it's up to and the improvements in its models. V3, version 3, is in the name. It's in the name. There were versions prior to that which you could have seen what was happening. I think the performance of the model is one thing. I think what really was what shocked and caused the stir was the fact that it was done on a cheaper basis and on perhaps, let's say, older infrastructure. Older, not in the context of the pace at which these AI infrastructure is moving. Yeah. And that's really what shocked people, I think. And then that brings up all the questions, right? Well, if you can do more for less, do we need all this infrastructure investment, these billions of dollars of infrastructure that's being committed? That's really the question mark.
I think one of the questions that people have is, DeepSeek is a private company, so how has it had such an impact on this stock market collapse, or at least this sell-off for a period? And obviously there has been a rebounding for those tech stocks, but why as a private company has such an impact? Yeah,
I hadn't seen anything like it before, really. This kind of model come out and it caused panic across public markets, particularly in the tech sector. Now, think about this. and it relates to the point I was just saying, big tech firms and semiconductor companies have said they're going to spend billions of dollars investing in infrastructure, whether that be a chip manufacturing plant or an AI data center, for example. So think about the Stargate project. You heard about that while you were away, the $500 billion investment plans by the US into AI infrastructure. Now you've got DeepSeek coming in saying you can do more for less, have a solid model on older tech. Basically. And that begged the question, is everyone overspending? Is it necessary to spend this much on infrastructure? And that's when you saw companies like Nvidia getting hit and other chip supply chain companies as well. If people can run good AI on some of these sort of less advanced Nvidia chips, then why buy the new upcoming stuff?
I suppose this $6 million, we have to take that as at face value, but can we trust what DeepSeek is saying, that it did cost $6 million?
It's a source of debate. I think the broad answer is there's some truth to it, but actually the figure's probably a lot higher because it's not encapsulating various overheads or hardware costs, etc. It doesn't actually encapsulate the whole kind of start to finish. So while it's true that it probably is very efficient and does cost less than others, the $6 million is probably not the true cost.
But it's still going to be much less than... Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I suppose next question is that if the infrastructure may not necessarily require that much spending to implement, to create these LLMs, then is that going to then impact the amount of money that's being spent?
Yeah, I don't know. And actually, Meta's earnings were just this week, and even Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Meta, admitted that he doesn't really know what the impact's going to be over the longer term at this point. But there is a range of opinion, which I think is worth digging in here. On the one hand, there's those that cite Jevons paradox, and I really don't want to go into this too much because someone's going to make fun of me or whatever. But I have to mention it because everyone's throwing this around on social media and on CNBC and everywhere else. And Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, was actually the first one who kind of brought this up in the kind of discussion around DeepSeek. It's this idea, I guess, that as technology becomes more efficient, becomes cheaper, its use actually increases a lot, and therefore the demand and use of the tech is higher. So as it does get cheaper, it will get more widespread, more adopted, more ubiquitous, and there will ultimately be need for more compute power, not less. So this will help more infrastructure and need more infrastructure.
And that's what the CEO of ASML was saying, really. So
exactly. That was his view.
Yeah.
But the other side of it is that actually, why do we need to spend more if we get good enough results with older hardware? Maybe you can develop more efficient models. Perhaps you might buy the new stuff, but there comes a point when the return on the investment doesn't justify the cost of buying new ones. But then, of course, one of the things that a lot of the infrastructure players are working towards are better power consumption efficiency. So the chips and the data centers cost less to run. So maybe that's a reason to upgrade if your overheads in terms of electricity are less. So there's so many different debates swirling around this. It's hard to tell right now in the panic and chaos of it all what the impact is. I can tell you that as we're recording this, just hours before, we've had earnings from Microsoft, from Meta, and from Tesla for the December quarter of 2024. And all of them didn't signal any cut to spending. They still said we're going to spend. Mark Zuckerberg of Meta actually said he thinks that spending on infrastructure is going to be a competitive advantage for companies, and that needs to continue. And so right now, a lot of the big tech companies, while they certainly would have been shocked and worried by the developments out of DeepSeek, I think they're still sticking with we need more infrastructure. We think we're just at the beginning of this, and we need to continue to spend.
It'd be interesting to see what they say in their next earnings.
Yeah.
That's
going to be interesting.
I suppose if the V3 model is more efficient, then it's got to have some serious tech behind it. Do we know anything about what it's been built on, how that development's happened?
Yeah, and actually, it's got a lot of praise from people in the US tech industry, including, like I said, Satya Nadella of Microsoft, who said there's real innovations there. Mark Zuckerberg, too, said actually they're going to look at what DeepSeek did and try to incorporate some of that into their own systems, which is, fascinating. A long time ago, people used to talk about Chinese companies as sort of imitators, not innovators. And so that has definitely changed over the past few years, and you are continuing to see that change happen. So the V3 is what's known as a mixture of experts, or a MOE model. So if we take some of the models out there, they're sort of monolithic beasts, run as one big model, right? And that's compute intensive. It has its own advantages. But when you're looking at efficiencies, these mixture of experts, or MOE models, are made up of lots of smaller models, but it doesn't run them all at once. So instead, it can pick and choose what part of the model it wants to run to get the best answer. This saves time and resource and makes it more energy efficient. So the best way, I think, to try to visualize it is, let's say I want to get the best answer to something, and I've gathered a bunch of experts: a historian, a biologist, a chemistry expert, a physicist, a gardening expert, all of these kind of various expertise. And I've got a question about what's the best time to grow a certain plant. I reckon, I might get some answers from the biology expert, but I might also get a lot more answers from the gardening expert, and those will go together, and I've got like a really good answer, right? And so that's, I think, the way to kind of think about these mixture of expert models.
Right. We also need to talk about the fact that DeepSeek's model is open source, and not all models are open source. Some are closed source. And last year when we were at Web Summit, we talked a lot about open source and closed source with some of the guests that we spoke to, and what's better and what's the future. Just give our listeners an understanding of kind of what they mean and why it's significant.
Yeah, so this open source debate question is pertinent, is key. When we talk about open source, or in this AI model space, what's known as open weight, it means that the model can be used and modified by developers, for example, any third party, without restrictions, or with very few restrictions. And so an example of open source software, for example, is Android on smartphones space. For many, open source is basically a way to drive innovation in the space, as it gives these developers, these researchers, for example, advanced tools to work with it and build upon, for free. And so, you can see new innovations coming out, people experimenting with it and building on it. And the key to open source too, with a lot of the technology, is to see if a third party can basically replicate the results of that open source model. So you have companies now who are trying to reproduce DeepSeek R1 off the source code to validate it, right, and build on it. And we may then know how actually efficient it is and how much it costs to run. And actually, can other researchers get the same efficiencies that DeepSeek was getting? And so that's quite important.
But I suppose, what's the benefit for DeepSeek to reveal all of this? Because, I'll just go back also to last year, just touch on this, but we talked a lot about how Chinese companies are going to struggle to catch up when the limitations are so strong on getting access to these chips, and yet they've proven that they can catch up, and pretty quickly, I may add. And okay, the LLM, the latest one that we're experiencing may not be as good, or may not perform in certain areas, but really, they've the stock market says it. It's really shocked everyone. So how, if they've made that catch up and it's open source, why would they then reveal how they've done it when the US is constantly putting barriers to them being able to develop?
Precisely for that reason. If it was closed source and DeepSeek went out into the world and said, hey, here's our model, the US could just go, yeah, no, you can't use that model, right? It's now open source. There's not really much the US can do about that. And so companies can now take that open source model in the US and run it on US servers without any data going to China and stuff. But what that means is they're running it based on a model designed out of China. and innovations will be built on top of that model to the point where maybe that model becomes the best in the world. And it almost becomes a global standard for open source AI models. And then maybe there's innovative applications, et cetera, that are built on top of it. And maybe DeepSeek can find a way to kind of figure out how to monetize that after.
Right.
But if the model itself improves, there may be ways for DeepSeek then to figure out how to make another version of that model that's commercialized, that's for enterprise or whatever that might look like. But for now, DeepSeek are basically asking the tech community to look at this model and maybe improve upon it.
And also take notice of them that they're serious players.
Yeah, Mark Zuckerberg said something interesting about DeepSeek on Meta earnings call. And he was basically saying that, I think he's feeling, because Meta has Llama, which is an open source AI model. And I think they're feeling the pressure because now all of a sudden you've got a real serious challenger to Meta's open source ambitions. He said that, we need to make Llama effectively the global open source standard. And it needs to be US technology. And now you've got a Chinese company in the mix coming to challenge that worldview. And so there are some advantages right now for DeepSeek to go open source. And one of those is to be able to get this spread far and wide across the world and used and potentially improved, innovated on, etc.
DeepSeek has caught up, or it looks like they've caught up, but is that something they'll be able to maintain in the future?
Well, this is such an interesting one. So for context, there are restrictions on the chips NVIDIA can ship to China. So far, China has been using the chips it got before the sanctions, and then what it can get its hands on now. Like, I'm not going to go into the whole thing about if they're secretly managing to get their hands on
black
banned
markets
black markets, and that's all speculation at this point. But I will say that NVIDIA right now, the chip restrictions are quite new. So, DeepSeek have managed to almost be on par with what the US has been able to get, roughly, in terms of access to those chips. So it can advance. It's still slightly behind, but the gulf isn't wide. However, as newer and newer chips come out, China won't have access to them. So as NVIDIA starts creating the next generation of chips and other companies start creating the next generation of chips, this may widen the gap in terms of the ability of AI applications between the US and China. So right now, you'd say China very much on par with the US in terms of the models. DeepSeek has proven that. And it's not just DeepSeek. You're seeing others like Alibaba's models and some of the other big models come out. And so there is a sense that actually, it's neck and neck. But I do think the gulf could widen as newer chips come out and China doesn't have access to them as well. The other side of this actually, though, is this could also threaten NVIDIA's dominance to some extent. If DeepSeek could do more with less, maybe you won't necessarily need as advanced chips for what's happening. And that could mean like Chinese chip firms could enter the fray here. Of course, you could counter that by saying that the newer chips are focusing, as I mentioned earlier on energy efficiency and trying to lower the power consumption and things like that. And so companies would want that technology. But again, that's a bit of the debate around the position of NVIDIA and can their dominance last for a lot longer or not.
What's been the reaction from US companies and President Trump as well?
So this was a real fascinating one because, many would have thought, maybe there would have been a sort of knee-jerk, right, let's ban some more chips or let's try to ban or put sanctions on DeepSeek or whatever. Rather than retaliating, President Donald Trump said DeepSeek's success should be, quote, a wake-up call for American AI firms. But I do think you are seeing some of the American AI firms feeling the heat. OpenAI potentially under pressure. And OpenAI, interestingly, came out not long after and said that it's found evidence that DeepSeek used some of OpenAI's proprietary models to train its own rival product through a process, what's known in the industry as distillation. It's quite a common industry practice. But OpenAI is concerned DeepSeek was doing it to build a competing service, which it says is against OpenAI's terms of service. Of course, the irony here is that OpenAI basically scraped the entire internet and data and everything to build its own models.
Yeah.
But perhaps
they might not have that much sympathy.
Yeah, and I don't think a lot of people in the tech community have that much sympathy either. for it. I've seen some interesting stuff on X and social media about people taking a very similar line, highlighting the ironies of it all. But perhaps this is a sign, OpenAI is feeling some of that heat.
Well, the other thing I was going to say is that I feel like it, as well as sort of lobbing off a whole load of market cap of some of these companies, but also it's dulled some of the gloss of the people that we've been focusing our attentions on when it comes to AI, the likes of Sam Altman and Jensen Huang, and feeling that these people were like, and these American companies were showing us the way and telling us how it was going to be when it comes to AI and building this whole industry, and this is the epicenter of it. And I feel like DeepSeek have kind of contradicted that. Yeah,
I think we always used to talk about China, and Chinese companies used to be a lot more vocal on the global stage, a few years back. And, you would hear people like Jack Ma of Alibaba on the world stage, now the big CEOs there. And of course, the whole, mood shifted in 2018. And, when we saw sort of the Trump trade war with China in his first administration and the impact that had. And there was almost this retreat from Chinese companies. And of course, I was in China at the time, and it was a lot harder for Chinese companies to come out, and it was a lot harder for us to speak to them and get interviews and get their point of view, because they wanted to just be under the radar, heads down, working. And I think that became even more pronounced during COVID, when effectively, the borders of China were shut. It was difficult for people to go in and out, and it was very insular. And a lot of the executives at the companies would just head down, focus what was going on in China and the development. Now, there's a lot of people that China, come out of nowhere, and these companies have come out. They haven't come out of nowhere. When ChatGPT was released, and there was the whole, it went all viral, and people were downloading it. And OpenAI was front and center, and it was raising billions of dollars. It wasn't a surprise that really not long after, call it 3-4 months, you heard the big Chinese firms, Baidu, Alibaba, and others, Tencent, said, hey, we also have an AI model. Now, they didn't just, whip this up in a couple of months and throw it out there. They've obviously been working on this for some time, just not making a big fuss about it, and a big kind of global splash about it. And so, a lot of people underestimated big time, I think, China's capabilities. I think they thought the restrictions were there. But remember, the restrictions on Nvidia chips are newish, last couple of years. So there would have been access to some of those chips prior to that. They would have been buying some of that up and had some capacity there. And as I mentioned earlier, the gulf wasn't wide. So this whole, this company's come out of nowhere, China's AI industry's come out of nowhere, it's not true. It's been in the works.
But for investors, it looked like they were blindsided, right?
It looked like it. But and Chinese companies were wildly underestimated. And you can see why. I mean, it's been a difficult time for the tech sector in China for the last few years, given the tightening grip from the government and some of the more regulatory sort of tightening, and, the way Chinese tech stocks have been hurt. And, it almost felt like people just kind of be like, the China story's done. There's no... It's over now. They can't get access to this. They're not going to do this. And, it's true, like, in some areas, very few areas, like in semiconductor manufacturing, yes, it's true. China not going to catch up tomorrow with what TSMC or Samsung and other companies can do in semiconductors. There's no ASML in China. There's no, competitors to certain companies in China. Right now, there's not really a major Nvidia competitor in China. They're working on it. They're working very, very hard on it, I can tell you that. But there are some areas like in software where China in the past few years has really excelled, and particularly in AI. And you see that with some of the driverless car companies have invested very heavily in autonomous driving and things like that. So there is an industry there. It's a government priority to make AI front and center and to make China a leader in this technology. So, yeah, it shouldn't be surprising that actually there is now a competitive model, several competitive models to some of the US technology.
Just final point. If people download the DeepSeek chatbot, they are going to come up against some guardrails and things that the chatbot may not be able to answer. And look, there's no such thing as a neutral response or explanation when it comes to large language models. But I think it's important to sort of say that there is a limitation there.
Yeah, there's a limitation. Look, if you ask it questions that are sensitive to Beijing, such as certain historical events or other questions about perhaps Xi Jinping, it's not going to answer it. I've seen so many stories about this. It's not. Why is everyone surprised? We know this is the case. I lived in China. If you go to Google, Google doesn't exist there. It's not a surprise. You can't. There are these political sensitivities. What do people expect to come out and start, ranting about the Chinese government? Of course, it's not going to do that. So it's no surprise. And I see these stories. It's funny every time a Chinese company's release a chat. We'll say, "Oh, can't answer questions about this. Can't answer questions about that." There's certain questions ChatGPT can't answer too. It's just interesting. I don't know why it's still surprising. You might not agree with it.
No,
like that's the thing. Like, and you might not agree with the level of kind of censorship and tightness on the internet in China, for sure. But
it's been like that.
It's not surprising now at this point.
Okay, well, that's been terrific and great to be back.
It's been lovely to have you back, Tom.
Thank you. That's it for this episode. Before we go, it'd be great if you could follow and subscribe to the show, and you can even leave us a review. And if you want to contact Arjun or I and have a question about a past episode, then email us at beyondthevalley@cnbc.com. Thank you, Arjun.
Thank you, Tom.
Next week, we'll be bringing you another special conversation from Davos on Beyond the Valley. Goodbye.
Beyond the Valley.